Hello and welcome to this video on dual slope generators and specifically ARC, a new module from NANO Modules. We'll explore what function generators are and how to use them, while demoing ARC and exploring how it works. Here's what's to come. This video is sponsored by NANO Modules. So as I said at the start of the video, this is a demo for ARC, the new module from NANO Modules. But what we're doing here is applicable to function generators and dual slope generators generally. So I hope there's lots to learn and explore as we go through the patches. Slope generators have their history in the Buchla 281 quad function generator and the Serge positive and negative slews that became the classic DUSG, dual universal slope generator. There's multiple modern recreations and variations of these ideas across multiple formats, and ARC builds on those ideas too. Going through the features of ARC here, we have two identical function generators with the same controls. We have our input, which is your signal input for processing audio, CV or gates, and we have a trigger input just above it that has a circuit to condition your signal to trigger a rise and fall cycle from the function. We have independent rise and fall times, and a speed switch that controls the range of these time controls to tailor that to your patches. And both the rise and the fall have independent curve or shape controls to go through exponential to linear and logarithmic curves. At the output stage of ARC, the function generator goes into a bipolar VCA, where we have manual level clockwise from center, and inverted or bipolar level control counterclockwise from center. We have CV inputs for separate rise and fall time modulations, as well as an exponential CV input that affects both the rise and fall time exponentially. And we also have a CV input here for the VCA, so you can control that bipolar VCA with other signals too. Each function has its main function generator output, as well as rise and fall gates that are high during the rising or falling states of the functions. In the middle, we have LEDs to show the rising and falling states of the functions, as well as the output signal, and we have the speed or range switch for our rise and fall times, and we have a loop switch that can automatically set these functions to loop, and you can also toggle this looping alongside the switch with an external CV or gate signal. And we also have a sustain switch for each side, so that these rises and falls can sustain in between those states at the trigger input. We have the mentioned CVs over the output VCAs, and then we hit a logic section, where we have a sum that mixes the output of both functions. We have an X is greater than Y comparator out, which when the X side voltage is higher than the Y side voltage, will receive a voltage at this output. And we have a logic OR and a logic AND, and these are analog, giving logic max and min outputs as well. That takes us through ARC. There's lots of patches and things to explore that you can apply to lots of modules that you might already have. Skip around the timing index, which is down in the description. A lot of time was spent breaking up all of these patches to make things easy to find. So with that said, let's dive in. So here we're going to take a look at envelopes. from the basics of just how envelopes work within function generators, through to something a little bit more advanced, musical and dynamic, like we have here. Now we'll strip this back and start from scratch. Now all I have here is my oscillator patched into a filter, and the output of arc, which is the green trace here on the scope, is what's going to modulate my filter cutoff. As I hit the manual gate, we can see that nothing happens, and that's because of the VCA and level control that we have here on arc. We need to turn this up in order to have some level at the output. Now function generators work with rise and fall times, and you often have curve controls. Let's make these linear to start with. And you can see that I'm just triggering, regardless of how long I hold, a rise and a fall. We've got really wide ranging times here, even in this medium range mode, from super short to super long. And as I make this linear fall here more exponential by going anti-clockwise, it'll actually affect the fall time, which will be faster, so I'll compensate by turning the fall up as I move the curve. We can go logarithmic. And then with the rise time, we have a range of shapes and times all accessible on those controls. Now we also have a sustain here. If I turn this up, it will actually hold as long as the gate at the input or on the button is held high. This works by rising. Think of it like a slew. It's slewing the onset of this gate. And then it holds as long as it holds, because the sustain is on, and then it will fall back down. Now we'll move to triggering this from a sequence, and I'll just bring that signal back up here on the scope. And I'm going to add a kick drum. It's just playing quarter notes softly in the background, just to kind of set the pace here. So trigger in this yellow trace to trigger. Sustain is off, and again we have this range of shapes and curves. Now with a basic envelope playing, you might have noticed that my sequence here, the triggers or gates coming in, are varying in gate length. So if I turn sustain on, those longer gates that have a longer gate length will actually sustain at the peak of the envelope. And if you can vary gate length on your sequencer, this is a musical way to play around with long and short notes. Turning off sustain, another common technique is to modulate the fall time or decay time to play around with the envelope shapes as your patterns play. I'm going to add a pitch sequence back into my oscillator, just to keep things musical here, and bring in the signal on the scope. And we'll use this step sequence that's playing in time with my gate pattern to modulate fall time. So that's doing the job of turning that knob for me per step for longer and shorter notes. And it adds a lot of musicality very quickly as this pattern plays around. You could add sustain back in as well. For even more rhythmic interplay. But as well as playing around with envelope shape in a musical way, because we have the VCA over the output, which is controlling the level of this envelope before it modulates the filter, we could use this step sequence for the level of each envelope rather than its fall time. So we now have these accents, louder notes, quieter notes. And hopefully you can hear this coming across and see there on the scope this velocity, this dynamic pattern. With the offset, you can offset this further, which is lifting that voltage up, opening the filter that bit more. You could add a bit of manual level, and even the sustain back in. Again, very musical, it adds velocity or dynamics to your envelopes, and then in this case, using that to modulate a filter creates a very musical pattern. So here I'm exploring some cross-patching for a kind of chained 4-stage envelope, and also some ping-pong cycling or ping-pong LFO-like behaviour. I have the X output here, green trace and cables. It's not going anywhere but the scope so you can visualise it. And the red trace there and red cable is the fall output, which is a gate that's active while this X function generator is in its fall stage. This fall gate comes to trigger the Y side, and the Y side is then the blue trace here. So you can see that blue stage Y side fires off during the period of that red fall gate. Now I'm not taking the blue output, it's some of the two sides, yellow cable, yellow trace. It gives me this kind of 4-stage rise, fall envelope. And I play with the curves and times here, and we'll just check out the response. Now, we can actually chain the behaviour here, so this side's fall gate triggers this one, but if we patch this fall gate to trigger this side, we'll create a kind of chain reaction that sets these looping, almost like a ping-pong LFO. Once again, I play with the different times and curves. Another thing that's interesting is if we, instead of triggering this side during the fall cycle, we toggle the looping during the fall cycle. And the timing of this Y side will determine how fast this loops, this kind of burst at the end of the modulation. And it's because this is a gated behaviour, it's only during that fall stage that the actual looping will be active. So the fall time will decide how long and how many repeats of this looping behaviour we get. We could do it from, say, the rise side. And let's actually patch this output into the Y side for the timing control and see what kind of behaviour we can get there. So lots of interesting, unique behaviours with a little bit of cross-patching. Now here's one of my favourite ways to use function generators, and that is creating a kind of accent and normal level or kind of 2 dynamic level envelope pattern. I'm doing that here with some added modulation, modulating a filter for the bass line against these drums. So as I got totally absorbed in the fun of a really driven filter that was kind of smushing together what was actually happening, I wanted to add just a clearer example here. If I remove the modulation of the VCA here in my mixer, the input is an oscillator with a basic 3-note arpeggio going round. And then the output of this triggered and input kind of 2-level accent envelope, modulating that channel. And the trigger will trigger a 10-volt envelope. The gate that is first going to the VCA and coming to the input is only 5 volts. So even at full level, it's half the level of a triggered envelope. But again, that's fully variable. You can watch that envelope come up in amplitude. And let's actually modulate this level in a VCA for something more dynamic with more than 2 levels here. So this is the gate into the VCA, randomly modulated in level each step, coming into the input, that's responding to these varying levels of gates. And then on top of that, we can still trigger an accent pattern. And most envelopes in most synths just go to their full peak, and that's kind of it. They're a little bit flat. So I find this a really exciting and musical way to work with the idea of velocity and dynamics. So here we're going to use a single function on Arc to create LFOs, looping functions or looping envelopes, with modulation for a nice complex wobble to go over this dubstep beat. Here's the beat. Really simple, but I'll mute that for now. So starting with Arc in a kind of neutral setting here, I have my oscillators mixed into a filter, and the output of Arc is going to modulate the filter cutoff. As I turn looping on and turn up the output VCA, I'm going to add a negative 5 volts of offset. LFOs are typically bipolar, so instead of having a unipolar modulator here where the red trace is 0 and the green is the output, I'm going above and below 0, giving a -5 to +5 LFO. Now of course the rise and fall time sets the shape and speed, as do the curves. We can use a trigger to re-trigger this, and that's this blue trace here and this blue cable. Let's patch that across to the trigger. And you can hear that gugum as it kind of trips itself up and re-triggers. Now the yellow trace here, which is a triggered envelope external to Arc, triggering at the same time as the trigger re-triggering Arc. This is going to modulate the exponential level, and as it's a negative voltage, that's going to slow down and then come back up again. If I make that a positive voltage, I can play with the attenuation of this off screen here. Let's invert it again. And as well as that modulation, I have another modulator here that is a random voltage every time this triggers at the start of the bar, and I'll use that to modulate fall time. So I'm re-triggering every start of the bar, re-triggering the actual function, triggering an envelope and a random voltage that are all going to modulate Arc. I have a gate here that I can patch into the toggling of this function, and rather than it toggling while it's active, This triggers and then toggles when this is lit up. I can be toggling all the time, and that toggle reverses its behaviour when the switch is up. So a gate coming in here will actually stop the toggling. I then have an envelope which I'm going to patch to the level here. We'll start inverted and let this push it closed and open again. So lots of complex modulation from simple sources, all with a single function. Bringing in the beat. If we had the other function doing anything here, whether it triggers envelopes, audio or LFOs, we could start using these logic outs to give some interesting behaviour that was dependent on how both the X and Y side are working. Now here we have this kind of classic, you'd find it on a monosynth, classic fading or delayed LFO. It's often used for vibrato, which is what I'm doing here. I have an LFO that wobbles and fades in amplitude, so that affects swells in modulation depth, and that controls vibrato, which is a wobble of pitch FM on my oscillator, and also my filter's cutoff. Now I'm using Y here, and if I just turn this up and remove these cables, this is constantly looping as an LFO, and when I play a note, we have the wobble of the looping envelope or function here, and we have the vibrato and filter movement. But as we have a VCA on the output here, let's turn this down and use the X function. I have a gate coming to the input, and it's going to slew the onset of that gate. It's the green tracing cables here, making a voltage rise, sustain, and then fall. If I use that to control the level, this will make that LFO amplitude fade, and you'll see that here on the blue trace. And I also have an attenuated copy of this coming into the exponential rate control, so the rate changes slightly as it swells in as well. We could make that more drastic. Two functions with the VCAs, one as an envelope that controls the output of the other, creating this classic fading LFO. So here's some nice rhythmic interplay by toggling on the looping. I have a basic triggered envelope modulating a filter, and I'm coming out of the sum output, which is the green trace here. If I turn down that channel in the mix, the X function, and turn up the Y function, I'm going to remove the input, and the blue cables and trace here show a gate, and this toggles momentarily. When the signal is high, the looping is on, when it's down, the looping is off. The switch will invert that behaviour. So switch down, so it's off by default, and I'm gating in the looping. And this is creating a kind of ratchet or burst. Mixing that against the steady envelope. It's quite nice as just a kind of subtle rumble and burst. It's not coming through as prominently in level as the triggered envelope. But as we can inject signals through the input here, let's send in another gate stream. We have one rhythm gating this, being slewed by the settings through the input, gated toggle, and let's mix that against the envelope. And And there's lots of places where you might want to toggle in the looping behaviour there for audio, sub-audio LFO type work. This is just one example playing around against the other function. So here I'm making use of the logic section with the OR and, which work as a logic max and logic min, maximum and minimum, and I'm using that to modulate two filters. The normal X output here, the green trace and cables, is modulating the inversion of a wavetable chord. The Y output, red cables and red trace, is also modulating the chord quality, but it's the max and min, yellow and blue here, that modulate the left and right side of a stereo filter. If I remove these for now, this is just the max and min. And these are just looping functions here, different curves, different times, and that interplay between them free running, but these outputs taking either the highest or lowest value between them, works really well as a stereo modulator. Let's change the chord quality again with the direct function outputs. And it's giving my noise modulated, kind of crusty, dusty chord tone some really nice movement here. So you can use ARC for a range of oscillator-like functions. Let's just turn down the output levels here. But this doesn't track VOT per octave across multiple octaves, so I'm not really going to focus on it too much as an oscillator. There's a lot of mileage to be had out of patching oscillators in or triggering it for sub-octave, subharmonic oscillations, which we'll explore more of. But just running down using ARC as an oscillator, we have loop on, shortest range. My output is turned up, giving the 0 to 10 volt envelope, and I'm applying a -5 volt offset for a -5 to +5, typical bipolar kind of LFO VCO like wave. Setting the wave shape and time here. The green trace and cable is our main output. We have pulses from the rise and fall. If we listen to rise, it's this really thin pulse as there's barely any rise time. We'll stick to patching the main out here. If I set the second function oscillating, loop on short range, and let's take its direct output, yellow trace here. Let's offset this negatively as well. We could patch this across to exponential inputs for FM, which is how this video started. And you could tune in lots of musical tones, they're just not going to track that well, which is typical of many analog function generators. We could also take the function and do AM by modulating the VCA, or ring mod with a bipolar VCA. Again, there's some really nice tones to be had. You could trigger. So let's turn off looping on this X side that we're listening to and trigger it from this side. Getting loop on. There's lots of sync tones. So there's a rather chaotic and noisy demo of ARC as an oscillator with AM, FM, sync tones. It's more useful working with oscillators, I feel, so we'll explore that later on in the video. So here we're going to look at clock manipulation with ARC. And there's a lot of kind of classic function generator patches here, including clock division, burst generation, trigger or gate delays, trigger to gate conversion, all with a more wonky timing here from the fall output. And a straighter, more on the beat, on the grid timing from the rise output. Now here's the kind of base state of the patch. The green input is my 16th note clock, and this trigger triggers that short little hi-hat in the background. But on top of that, the output of arc here, blue cables, blue trace, will trigger an additional hi-hat. This is also going to trigger the envelopes for my baseline. So with my clock coming in, basic envelope settings, fast times here, and I'm using the rise output. If we increase the rise time, we can actually use this like a clock divider. And this works because the function doesn't actually reset during its rising stage. When it's triggered and that voltage is rising, it ignores the other incoming triggers until it's reached its peak and it's in its fall stage. Interestingly, if we take the fall output here, this works like a trigger delay. Any rise time adds time and distance before it gets to that fall stage. So we get flams, trigger delays. Let's stick to the rise output here and be completely on grid. If we toggle on the looping, we can have a burst generator. So using this red trace and red cable, we're toggling in or gating in these little bursts. And we can use the yellow trace here, a step sequence, and modulate this rise time to go through different divisions of this incoming clock. Let's use the modulation to do this rather than turning it by hand. So we're using a CV sequence to influence clock division, creating a unique rhythm. But that fall output won't just divide quite evenly as we've heard. We'll get all these odd shifts and trigger delays. So if you're looking for some wonkier timing or getting off grid and off beat, this can be really useful. Let's toggle in these loops again, these bursts. So let's take a look at slew limiting here. You can think of slew as a lag processor, a glide, a portamento. It's a function that basically smooths out hard edges and slows down the rate of change. Now I have separate hard left and right pan signals here. The green and blue trace is the X function, red and yellow the Y function. The X is currently left, the Y is currently right. But let's just go down to this more basic just square wave clock signal here on the X function. I'm in the fastest range here, and as I increase the rise time, you start to hear this kind of whip, this whoop. Do the same for the fall. As I increase these further, you can see on the blue trace there, well, the input is high, it's rising to that value, and then once it goes low, it falls afterwards. And you can simply think of the rise as an attack time, and the fall as a release. And let's hear this on this stepped random signal on the Y side. The red trace and cables is a stepped random input, so hard edges, but random values coming through. And again, this goes to the input. Let's go medium time range, change the rise and fall. And you can hear how it's still instantly rising when the voltage goes up at the input. With some fall time added, it kind of releases, glides and slides down to the next value. We could do this the other way. Instant fall to the value, but have a longer rise. And with enough rise and fall, it turns our stepped random voltage into more of a kind of smooth, fluctuating random voltage. So while we have this dual slew patch set up, I just wanted to kind of sneak in a couple of extra features here. This is still a gate signal, just slightly slower. This is still a stepped random signal, both coming to the inputs. And the sum of them, so the slewed gate and the slewed step random, are the yellow trace and yellow outputs here. That now modulates both sides of a stereo filter. And the purple cable's blue trace here, which is when X is greater than Y, it's just a gate signal, and the voltage on the X side is higher than the one on the Y side, it gives a gate. And I'm using that to turn on and off vibrato, which is LFO to pitch in my patch. If I add more of that into my oscillator, you can hear this. You can hear that wobble there more clearly. You'd still have your direct slew outs, your gates that are generated during the rising and falling stages. I just wanted to show that sum and the X and Y in addition to what we've seen slewing two signals there. So here I'm using one of the function generators on ARC as a low pass filter. I have some drums, which I'll mute for now. And this is what's coming through ARC. Let's pull the patch and then build it back up again. At the Y input here, I have a saw wave from my oscillator. We can't hear anything currently because the level is down. ARC has those output VCAs or polarizing bipolar VCAs. So I'll turn up the level. And then the rise and fall time are much like the frequency control on a filter. So if we modulate both of them together, which is what the exponential CV input does here, this is like modulating the frequency control or the cutoff control on a filter. The X function generator here is this yellow trace, yellow cables, just a basic triggered envelope. So let's patch that into the exponential in. And this is like envelope modulating a low pass. I have the green trace, another clocked envelope, and that's an external envelope generator, and I'll use this to the Y level, the VCA CV, just to create a note that isn't constantly droning. So VCA with envelope control, and then the filter or the rise and fall with its envelope control. At this point, let's add in a pitch sequence back to my oscillator. And there's a definite kind of quirky character here that I enjoy, but you can also play with kind of further character, more kind of resonance if you like, by looping the function generator. If I simply turn on loop, we have this really kind of aggressive, kind of driven, acidic type sound. It's a little bit much here, but I can toggle this on and off in certain steps. Let's use the blue trace here as a toggle signal. Let's add the LFO back to fall as well. So an oscillator in, level modulated with a clocked envelope, another envelope modulating rise and fall like modulating cutoff, an LFO just to the fall, which also kind of is a cutoff modulation if you like, and toggled looping for a kind of toggled burp of resonance. Just in the same way that we can take a clock as a trigger and use the rise time that won't reset while the rise is active as a clock divider, we can use audio as a trigger and use this as a sub-octave or sub-harmonic divider. That's what we have here. The green trace is my input trigger, and this is the sound that we have pan slightly left. It is coming through a filter. I'll clear all this in a moment. And then out of arc, pan slightly right. I'm sequencing rise time to sequence through sub-octaves and sub-harmonics. Now, as I have, let's pull this and start from scratch. So this is my input waveform here, green trace, green cables, and I have a copy split that's going off into the mixer. For now, I'll mute it. And the output of arc is the blue cables and blue trace. As I move the rise time, we have a PWM-like effect. That then turns into a subharmonic or a suboctave. And you see we get these little glitches and pulses. Lead to some interesting sounds. Now if I modulate this and actually CV sequence rise time, I'll just adjust the manual level. You can see we're quickly sequencing through different subs. Now just listening to the input wave, if I add a little bit of vibrato to this oscillator, here it's got that little wobble on it. This will all pass through as well. I'll add a pitch sequence to my oscillator. Let's add in my filtering again. Input sound. This has an envelope to filter cutoff just down here. That happens once per note change. The output of arc. Has some clock changes happening. Both together. And some effects just to fill out the space in the background. So here we're using arc as a pretty incredible kind of fuzz and distortion generator. What's coming in is a rings-ish car+ strong plucked string out of Platts. This is dry in the mixer. That comes into arc, and I'm taking the rise and fall outputs, which hit those comparators and create those square waves, and they're coming out as stereo, first into the scope just to visualize, but then into the mixer here. Rise and fall times have an effect on the sound. You can get this really spitty fuzz effect. Let's go slightly longer range. You can get a different spitty fuzz effect that way. Or just this thick kind of wall of distortion. We could loop these. There's kind of strange oscillating fuzz. So here I'm having some fun with quite a lot of audio processing, mainly VCA and kind of ring mod processing, but additional filtering, kind of looping, pseudo resonance, taking out multiple layers and also some effects. So I've changed to a pulse at the input here so you can clearly see how these affect the kind of filter-like quality over a pulse wave. But what I'm mainly concerned with here is this VCA and the polarizing bipolar VCA. So I'm going to use a square wave sub as my level control, and this will push positively and negatively, working like a ring modulator. And ring modulation with this additional slewing or filtering. and then the ability to push in manual level, or inverted manual level, works really well for sculpting a waveform. Now I'll swap my input back to a sine wave, and let's turn on the looping, which gives these kind of resonant-like spikes. So you're just listening to a sine wave input, square wave ring modulated with the function looping. So lots of really interesting audio processing there, and we could patch this across to the other function generator to simply use the VCA just for some level control, and patching in an envelope here. Ring modulation, looped function on this side, into this side, like a VCA. We could use the rise and fall here to kind of filter this or slew it. You could loop this one as well. If I add a sequence to my oscillator, I can get a more consistent tone by having this somewhat track pitch. Now this doesn't track pitch across multiple octaves accurately, but it will be more consistent than not patching this in. So this is a copy of the volt per octave to exponential here. And you can hear across the pitch range, the tone is more consistent. Now muting that, I have another channel here, which is the pulse out coming through a filter. If I open this up fully, this is a pulse that's high, or a gate that's high anytime the fall is active. With all these great sync sounds when looping is on. If we want to take this complex sound and then create a more complex pulse, we can simply come out of this side. And it's not the level modulation here, it would just be this wave that's been turned into a pulse stream. Filtering this with some modulation, steps cut off an envelope controlled filter. That creates one layer that plays against the other. And then my delay back in. And it's just more fun audio processing that's not your standard set of kind of filters, VCAs, low pass gates. There's more of a kind of quirky sound to this that's worth exploring. If you've got this far in the video, go drop a hard sync in the comments. Head over to patreon.com/divkid to support the work that I do, gain access to exclusives and the DivKid Discord community. Thanks for watching, hit like and subscribe, that helps too, and I'll see you next time. Bye!